This is US foreign policy in the 21st century, and today I'm going to do class number 7, in which we will discuss the United States and the Middle East. And by way of introduction, we will turn to our next slide, which is a cartoon I found a couple of years ago. The date on it, if you look in the bottom right corner, is 2016. So it was drawn during the 2016 presidential election. And of course, on the left-hand side, we can see a grinning Hillary Clinton on top of a warplane bombing somewhere in the Middle East. And then on the right-hand side, we've got Donald Trump, also in a warplane bombing somewhere in the Middle East. And presumably what the cartoonist is trying to say here is that in terms of American foreign policy towards the Middle East and the possibility of military intervention, obviously, yeah, as you can see in terms of the writing, which is in Arabic in the top middle, obviously this was a cartoon which presumably appeared in a Middle Eastern publication. I can't remember exactly where I found it. So this is a sort of Arab perspective, presumably, when it comes to America. And the cartoonist saying that it probably makes little difference who the Americans elect, that American policy towards the Middle East won't change fundamentally, and America's inclination towards military action, bombing, other types of intervention probably wouldn't be much different regardless of who the Americans choose as their president, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. Obviously, we're now 4 years later. And Trump has a 4-year record in terms of foreign policy. And yeah, we will consider a little bit about Trump and his approach towards the Middle East. What is interesting, I think, about Trump is that when he campaigned for the presidency during 2016, his message was in some ways quite anti-interventionist. He was very critical of America's decision to go to war against Iraq in 2003. He promised that he would be withdrawing American troops from various parts of the world, including Afghanistan and also Iraq. So in terms of his sort of campaign, Trump certainly, his message was that he was not going to be a president that was going to be dispatching American military forces to other parts of the world. In terms of his record so far, I think Trump's record is pretty mixed. I mean, he certainly has withdrawn American troops from some parts of the world. Most controversially, a few months ago, he decided that America was going to unilaterally withdraw some of its military forces from Syria. That decision attracted a lot of controversy. People thought that this would simply sort of destabilize the region, allow other potentially hostile or malign actors to move into the vacuum that the United States had left behind. But, from Trump's perspective, he was simply fulfilling his campaign promises. On the other hand, we have seen a couple of interventions. So despite the rhetoric of being anti-interventionist, in terms of his approach, there's at least a couple of examples in where Trump has ordered military action. Once when, I forget the exact date, but fairly early on in his presidency, I think it was beginning of 2017, Trump ordered bombing raids against Syria after it had been revealed that the Syrian government under President Assad had used chemical weapons against civilians. Trump responded to that by kind of unilaterally ordering the bombing of certain targets in Syria. More recently, of course, beginning of this year, 2020, Trump ordered the assassination of an Iranian general, which many people thought was, a very a very aggressive action on the part of the Trump administration. Should be noted that relations between the United States and Iran have deteriorated quite markedly during the Trump presidency. One of his first actions, well, actually, it wasn't. It took him a little while. There was a slight delay, but anyway, Trump ultimately, a few months into his presidency, decided that the United States would withdraw from the nuclear agreement that the Obama administration had negotiated with Iran. Since then, relations have deteriorated. And Trump certainly views Iran as a particularly hostile actor in the region. We'll talk a little bit about the relations between the United States and various countries in the region in a moment. So yeah, relations between the United States and Iran which have never been particularly good. There was a slight improvement during the Obama administration, but as I say, these have worsened quite significantly in the course of the Trump administration. Iran too has withdrawn from the nuclear agreement and is now widely thought to be again back on a path towards developing some kind of nuclear capability, which obviously the United States is absolutely against. So as I say, yeah, Trump's record in terms of his approach to the Middle East somewhat mixed, particularly in the area of military intervention. So perhaps, the cartoonist here broadly correct in the interpretation that under Trump, despite the rhetoric, the United States has, at least on occasion, decided to intervene quite directly when it felt that its interests were threatened. Staying with Iran for a moment longer, we have a headline here. Iranian boats come dangerously close to US Navy warships. I found this article on the Guardian website yesterday, so this was the 16th of April 2020. Below that, IRGC Navy, which presumably this is the Iranian Navy. I think would be Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Not quite sure what the C would stand for there. Navy boats condemned for harassing approaches. So harassing meaning trying to disturb, annoy, if you like, the United States. US officials say 11 small boats circled 6 US warships. Okay, warships, naval vessels. Iranian Navy vessels came within 10 yards of American warships, it says below there. In the Persian Gulf, in which the US Navy described as a series of dangerous and I've cut it off there. Okay, but again, illustrating that American-Iranian relations are quite markedly strained here. These sorts of actions, the use of Iranian Navy to approach American and other countries' warships, that is not unusual. This sorts of harassment actually occur at fairly regular intervals. I remember a few years ago, a small British boat was seized by the Iranians carrying some British naval officers and possibly some Marines as well, that they were seized by the Iranians claiming that they had ventured into Iranian territorial waters. The British disputed this. So I say these sorts of kind of harassment or actions, not as I say, an irregular occurrence. But again, as I say, illustrates the fact that relations between the United States and Iran are pretty strained at the moment. In fact, they have been pretty strained, really, since the Iranian Revolution, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Okay, let us turn to our map. And if we were in class, my first question to you would be, which countries are America's friends in the region and which countries could be considered enemies? For what it's worth, we're talking about the Middle East. I tend to view the Middle East really as this sort of area. I'm putting a circle around with this sort of marker pen. So probably, I think I would probably include Egypt, although it's sort of into North Africa. Israel, obviously. Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Kuwait. We'll talk a little bit about Kuwait in a moment. United Arab Arab Emirates, Qatar. Again, we need to talk a little bit about that. And then, as I mentioned, Iran could kind of come into this block. I would tend to say Afghanistan, Pakistan. I would kind of classify these more as being sort of southern Asia. So I would say, in terms of my own sort of geographical conception of the Middle East, I would put it, as I said, roughly that area. Turkey, as I say, Turkey certainly on the kind of frontier between Europe and the sort of Middle Eastern region. I would kind of probably put Turkey more into sort of Near East, and countries like obviously Libya, Algeria. These would be sort of now North Africa. So as I said, my main area of interest today, as I say, is kind of broadly this sort of geographical area. And the sort of dynamics. And as I say, my first question would be who are America's friends and who are America's enemies? Before we go there, it's just worth noting in terms of sort of power in dynamics of the region, the two big powers are certainly Saudi Arabia and Iran. So these are big in terms of their sort of overall size, but also in terms of economy, population, and also the sort of leadership role that they play in the region. And I think it's fair to say relations between these two countries are not good. You know, historically they too have been strained. Partly it is the relationship is strained partly out of, if you like, sort of the power politics of the region. Essentially, you've got two big powers more or less sort of juxtaposed together. They don't share a common frontier, but as you can see from the map, they're in pretty close proximity with one another. So it's partly a sort of power political play, both countries viewing, wanting to sort of extend their influence throughout the region. But mixed into that, of course, is a significant sort of religious divide. Saudi Arabia, obviously they are both Muslim countries, but Saudi Arabia is predominantly Sunni, whereas Iran is Shia, and that obviously also creates tensions. It should be said that virtually all the countries in the region have sort of mixed populations of Sunni and Shia. Some countries are predominantly Shia. Some of the countries more have a larger Sunni population, but that sort of religious divide, as I say, extends right the way throughout the region, which obviously is a complicating factor. One other thing I would say before we get on to the friends and enemies part of this is the American intervention in Iraq in 2003, or the war against Iraq in 2003. That had, I think, monumental consequences for the region, and we are still living with the consequences of that. So George W. Bush, this is Bush Younger, who was president from 2001 to the beginning of 2009. After the 9/11 attacks, 2002, 2003, he decided to remove Saddam Hussein, who was the dictator of Iraq. Iraq had an authoritarian regime. Relations between the United States and Iraq had been extremely bad since the 1991 Gulf War, in which the United States had launched a war against Iraq in order to liberate Kuwait. So 2002, 2003, Bush decided that he'd had enough of Saddam Hussein, and the Americans intervened ostensibly on the grounds that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction, but it was also, I think, fairly apparent that another objective was what was known as regime change. In other words, the Americans wanted to remove Saddam Hussein from power and establish a different type of government. In fact, part of a neoconservative agenda was that they wanted to sort of intervene directly in the Middle East in order to help construct democratic governments in the region. I think it's fair to say the war in Iraq did not go particularly well. I mean, Saddam Hussein was toppled pretty quickly, but the subsequent occupation proved to be extremely difficult for American forces. There was a lot of disorder, warfare, violence in Iraq, which effectively created the conditions for Al-Qaeda to move into that particular country. I mean, paradoxically, I think Iraq was the one place in the Middle East where Al-Qaeda did not actually have much of a foothold until 2003. But toppling Saddam Hussein effectively allowed, radical Islamic groups to emerge in Iraq. They were very much part of the insurgency against U.S. forces in that particular country. And a little later, Al-Qaeda was subsequently sort of replaced with the Islamic State, ISIS, which has also moved into the region, and kind of disordered disturbances created by the Arab Spring 2010, 2011 also created a vacuum in some countries, notably Syria. So radical Islamic movements have for a time at least sort of gained a kind of foothold in the region. But yeah, as I say, a lot of this stems all the way back, or can be taken all the way back to the Bush administration's decision to go to war against Iraq in 2003. And as I say, the consequences for that are still kind of reverberating across the region right to this day. Okay, go back to the original question. America's friends and America's enemies. Let's deal with, I suppose we'll deal with friends, or notionally friendly states within the region. As I mentioned, the two big powers, Saudi Arabia and Iran. We've mentioned Iran already. Saudi Arabia, yes, certainly considered to be pretty much an ally of the United States. In fact, one of the reasons why America went to a war against Iraq in 1991 was to protect Saudi Arabia. There was a fear that Saddam Hussein could, after having invaded Kuwait, could turn against Saudi Arabia. So for various reasons, Saudi Arabia is considered to be an important ally, not least, of course, because it is the world's biggest oil producer. So there are sort of very kind of close ties there. Saudi Arabia also purchases a lot of military equipment from the United States, not just the United States, but other Western states as well. But Saudi Arabia is a major customer in that regard. Until 2003. America also had military bases in Saudi Arabia. So there are very sort of strong ties between the United States, and these are actually quite historic. You can take the ties between the House of Saud, this being the Saudi royal family, and the United States for you can pretty much trace that all the way back to at least the Second World War, essentially, sort of tacit understanding emerging that Saudi Arabia would allow the Americans access to oil. In return, the Americans would, to some degree at least, be responsible for Saudi security. So Saudi Arabia, obviously, a really important player. The other country, of course, we need to talk about, and we will do, is Israel. Again, some very close historic ties between the United States and Israel, and I would say the bilateral relationship between the United States and Israel is probably one of the most important and also one of the most controversial dimensions of American foreign policy. We'll talk a little bit about that a bit further down the line. Other countries in the region worth pointing out: Kuwait. Again, Kuwait, extremely important. Like Saudi Arabia, there is a royal family which effectively runs Kuwait. Like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait as well, another big oil producer. Kuwait also hosts some important American military bases. So Kuwait certainly viewed as a really important partner. Looking further down, Qatar, also big naval base there. Again, another, in this case, quite a small state, but nonetheless, strategically quite important. So yeah, worth noting. Worth noting these. Just looking further down, I mean, it's across the Red Sea, but Djibouti, which very close to Yemen, but that too also hosts American bases. So again, another quite important part of the world. And then relations with Jordan, royal family there as well. Again, broadly, you could say broadly good in that sense. Okay, countries where we need to talk about Iraq. And I think America's relations with the current Iraqi government pretty complicated. As I said, United States toppled Saddam Hussein in 2003, but then was mired in this sort of insurgency in Iraq for quite a long time. Current Iraqi government, to some extent, I think it would be fair to describe the current Iraqi government being kind of sort of sandwiched in some ways, I suppose, between the United States on one hand, which is still quite an important provider of security, or at least the Iraqi government is still relying on the United States in some ways for support in this area. On the other hand, there's also facing pressure from Iran. The Iraqi-Iranian relationship is significant because, like Iran, Iraq is majority Shia, has a majority Shia population. Although, if you look at a map of Iraq, you can see it's quite mixed in terms of its ethnicities. There's Shias, Sunnis, also Kurds, and probably other groupings as well. Iraq itself is quite diverse, but it is a majority Shia population. On the other hand, before Saddam Hussein was removed, it was the Sunni population who were in control, and actually, relations between Iraq and Iran had been strained. In fact, the two countries went to war in the 1980s. But as I say, Shias are the majority group within Iraq, and so again, paradoxically, one consequence of the Bush administration's decision to go to war against Iraq is that to some extent Iraq has now sort of moved into the Iranian orbit. So relations, as I say, Iran now exercises quite a lot of influence in Iraqi politics, which is obviously not something that the Americans would have wanted in 2003. Okay, in terms of enemies, yes, the main hostile actor, let's say, in the region is certainly Iran. And as I mentioned earlier, hostility between these two states can be taken all the way back to the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Before 1979, actually, Iran was quite a close ally of the United States. It was led by an authoritarian leader, the Shah of Iran. The CIA played a very influential role within the country. But in 1979, you have a religious revolution. The Shah was overthrown, sent into exile. A radical Shia government, Islamic government, comes into power, and relations between America and Iran deteriorate quite markedly. Not least because in 1979, the American embassy in Tehran was seized by a revolutionary group. American diplomats were taken as hostages, held in some pretty unpleasant conditions, and this led to a very long, drawn-out crisis. Ultimately, the hostages were actually freed, but it resulted in a very sort of bitter legacy. So relations between Iran and the United States have been pretty strained since then. And Iran, from the American perspective, Iran is seen as being a particularly bad actor. As I mentioned earlier, it's one of the big powers, along with Saudi Arabia, in the region. Iran has wanted to extend its influence. As I said, Iranian influence has extended into Iraq. Iran has also been pretty active in Syria as well. So from the American perspective, Iran is a sort of destabilizing presence within the region, a country that they wanted to contain. Also, Iran has made no secret that it wishes to become a nuclear power, which, from the American perspective, is something that they want to try and prevent, almost at all costs, I would say. Should also be said there are other countries in the region who are also alarmed at the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran. Saudi Arabia, as I say, being Iran's main rival. I think it's clear. I mean, the Saudis have said that if Iran were to develop nuclear weapons, they would follow suit and become a nuclear power themselves. Then obviously Israel, which virtually all Arab states, Islamic states, have a troubled relationship with Israel. But Iran particular, again, Iran, a sort of revolutionary country, and the Iranians have made it pretty clear that they want to see Israel wiped off the map. Israel, of course, is a nuclear power. That's one of the reasons why the Iranians are anxious to acquire their own nuclear deterrent. But yeah, as I say, from the American perspective, Iran is the number one bad actor in the region. Then, of course, you sort of have to distinguish between the various governments, the royal families in the region, and popular opinion in the Middle East. And I think it's fair to say popular opinion in the region is overwhelmingly sort of hostile to the Middle East. We mentioned Saudi Arabia, for example. I mean, yes, the Saudi royal family has very close ties with the United States. But it's worth noting that the 9/11 attacks, so terrorist attacks, September the 11th, 2001, in Washington, New York, most of the people involved in those attacks were from Saudi Arabia, which again is sort of a reflection of the fact that even if the various governments in the region enjoy fairly close relations with the United States, the actual people living there tend to be pretty hostile to the United States. Should also be noted, I mean, again, and this is quite an important point, Saudi Arabia, yes, the government there, on the one hand, views itself as a friend and an ally of the United States. On the other hand, a lot of money actually comes. Yeah, a lot of money comes out of Saudi Arabia and is funneled into various religious charities and non-governmental organizations, and a lot of that money then finds its way to various kind of Islamic schools and colleges in the region, and also ultimately ends up into the funds of some quite radical organizations. So indirectly, Saudi Arabia actually does sponsor a lot of radical Islamic groups, which again creates sort of tensions. On the one hand, Saudi Arabia is supposedly an American ally. On the other hand, as I say, Saudi Arabia also basically finances organizations like, or I say finances, but a significant percentage of organizations like Al-Qaeda, Islamic State. Their money comes from Saudi Arabia, which again sort of reflects the sort of ambiguity, I suppose, when it comes to America's relations with various governments in the region. Now, as that summary sort of indicated, yeah, and I don't pretend for one moment to be a sort of Middle Eastern expert, but as that summary indicates, yeah, relations between the various countries in the region are rather complicated, and one of my favourite cartoons here sort of reflects this. I'm not going to read everything there, but again, this cartoon appeared in The Economist a few years ago, but it says here, up to the minute handy map of the Middle East, showing the relations between between various countries. You've got Iran here, and a hand extending out towards Israel, saying revulsion. Then you've got Saudi Arabia pointing at Iran. Loathe meaning hate. Similarly, the other way, Iran to Saudi Arabia. Despise. Then, yeah, line there back to Bahrain. I think that these two are pointed at. Covet meaning the Iranians want Bahrain. The Saudis, they're saying keep your hands off. Okay. Egypt, pointing there, don't like Arab autocrats. Saudi Arabia, but you like cheap oil. Mubarak, who used to be the former Egyptian leader, but who has since been deposed a few years ago. Mubarak's friend, America say Honsi Mubarak. Just looking at some of the kind of American, USA pointing to Iraq saying had enough. Israel, what's this? It's complicated. Yeah, relations between Israel and Jordan. I think that's a fair summary. Israel, pointing to America, not your pawn. America saying, get with it, pal. I should say, yeah, relations between Obama, we'll talk about this in a moment, but relations between the Obama administration and Israel were quite, again, were somewhat ambivalent in several respects. Since Trump has come into office, I think Trump, is fair to say, is much more supportive and has a much more favourable view of the current Israeli government, and we will talk about that in a moment. So yeah, as the map here says, the various dynamics within the region are extremely complicated. So again, if I was actually in the class, probably the next question I would ask is, why is the Middle East so important for the United States? The textbook answer here, 3 reasons. First, number one, obviously oil. Okay, so the Middle East is the world's biggest oil producing region. So pretty much the whole of the industrialized world, to varying degrees, is reliant on Middle Eastern oil. Obviously, there are other big oil producers. Russia, of course, being another. Nigeria, you could add. The United States, also an oil producer, and actually, with shale gas technology, America has become less dependent on Middle Eastern oil than it had been. But still, the region is still extremely important in geopolitical terms because, as I say, it is the big oil producer. So yeah, if we go back to our map of the region, yeah, it's notable that Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, Iraq, these are all big oil producers. So you have these very sort of complicated political and religious dynamics between these various countries. Added to that, you have their sort of geopolitical importance for each one of them, as I say, being really important oil producers in the region. So oil is the single biggest reason why the United States and other countries take such an interest in what is happening in the Middle East. A second consideration, fear that the region could come under the influence of a rival power. That was especially true during the Cold War, where the nightmare from Washington's perspective was what might happen if the Russians were to start to encroach in the region. This this worry became particularly acute after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, when suddenly you had the Red Army literally on the borders of Iran, and there was there was this nightmare that maybe the Russians could sweep into Pakistan, cross the Gulf into this region here. So fear of Russian influence in the region was certainly something that the Americans worried about. More recently, I think growing Chinese influence is also a factor which worries the United States. Russia, of course, also remains a significant player. The fact that there are Russian military forces in Syria now, that is also something that from the American perspective, that too would be considered a source of concern. So in that sense, yes, the Middle East has always been a sort of region, or I say always, but in the 20th century, and certainly after the Second World War, the Middle East has been a sort of area of great power competition. The United States has wanted to sort of protect its role as being the sort of preeminent power within the region. Before the Second World War, it was the British who were the dominant force, but essentially what you see after the Second World War is that British power declines and is sort of replaced by the United States. Third thing that we've already touched upon is the special relationship that the United States has with Israel. So for all these three reasons, America plays a very important role within the region. Okay, this slide gives some of the sort of history. I suppose America's involvement in the region really begins at a significant level after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. If you look at the modern map of the Middle East, which we just had a look at, the states which appear on the map appear after the First World War, and it's largely as a result of the British and the French drawing up the frontiers. So as I say, Ottoman Empire collapses, and these new states appear on the map of the Middle East after the First World War. As I said, Britain in the 1920s and 1930s was the dominant power within the region, but when it becomes apparent that the region is basically one big oil field, obviously American corporations and also the American military become much more interested in it. In the 20s and 30s, there's definitely a certain amount of competition between the United States and Britain, and the French as well. But as I say, it's post-war, it's after the Second World War where American influence really begins to kind of rise. And the strategy of containment against the Soviet Union, which I mentioned a moment ago, becomes important. Another factor that's worth considering is, this is the point here, the Middle East is at the intersection of three continents. So it's kind of at a crossroads. You've got Africa here, Asia there, and then Europe up there. So if you like, three areas are kind of more or less sort of rubbing up against one another. And again, that also means that, from the American perspective, you don't want the region to fall under the control of a hostile power. And 58% of the world's known oil reserves added to that. So, for all these reasons, of course, the United States is going to take an interest in the Middle East. One or two events, I'm not going to read through all of these, but important moments, let's say, in the history of the Middle East and the United States, involved in a few of them. One of the key dates, I suppose, is at the beginning, 1917, when the British government issues the Balfour Declaration and effectively promises British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So this is the moment where essentially the British commit themselves to a Zionist policy. They want to see some form of Jewish state in Palestine. The British in the 1920s and 1930s in control of Palestine. Palestine was a British colony. There was an attempt to sort of partition Palestine what today we would describe as a two-state solution. That never really comes to pass, though, and it's only after the British withdrawal from Palestine in 1948 that you see the founding of Israel and the first of what was to be a succession of Arab-Israeli wars during late 40s, 1950s, 60s, and into the 1970s. Just looking down this, formation of the Baghdad Pact. This was sort of a military alliance involving a number of Arab countries and Britain. The Suez Crisis. This was an Anglo-French, so British and French intervention against Egypt in 1956. What was notable about that crisis was that the Americans publicly opposed the British and French intervention. President Eisenhower decided that he did not want to antagonize Arab opinion in the Middle East, Arab nationalism in the Middle East, by siding with the British and the French. So this was an occasion where the Americans were against a form of direct military intervention in the Middle East. A couple of years later, though, the US does send in Marines into Lebanon in response to a series of revolutions in the Middle East. So again, an indication that the United States was willing to directly intervene militarily in order to protect its interests in the region. 1966, British finally withdraw militarily from the Middle East, so they close down their bases there. 6-Day War. That is significant because that sort of changes the map of the Middle East and the dynamics of the Middle East quite significantly. I'll just go back to our map. This is a war between Israel and basically virtually all the surrounding Arab states within the region, and it results in a major Israeli military victory. And one consequence of that is that Israel seizes a clutch of new territories, including Gaza down in the south, the West Bank, which was west of Jerusalem. Jerusalem itself was, the whole of Jerusalem was seized by Israel, and then the Golan Heights with Syria. So the map, in terms of Israel's frontiers change. Essentially, Israel gains a kind of clutch of new territories. Another consequence of that is that after the Israelis seize these territories, a lot of Palestinians are turned into refugees and have to flee to neighbouring states. And again, that has sort of huge sort of political consequences in the region. Okay, another Arab-Israeli war in 1973, which again sort of results in a Israeli victory. And then 1978, you have the Camp David Accords, which basically negotiates a peace settlement between Egypt and Israel. So it brings to an end this sort of long-running conflict between Israel and Egypt, which stabilizes Israel's southern front, although kind of Palestinians and other Arab nationalists view this almost as a sort of betrayal by the Egyptians. Then the next big event, as we mentioned a moment ago, was the Iranian Revolution. So overnight, Iran goes from being an ally of the United States to being one of America's principal opponents. Following from that, beginning of the Iraq-Iran War in the 1980s, which I mentioned earlier. 1982, Israel invades Lebanon, and there's a sort of long drawn-out war there. One or two other events. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait that we mentioned earlier. In the 90s, you see the beginning of a peace process between Israel and its neighbouring Arab states. But, despite sort of promising beginnings, it never really fulfills its promise, and then 2001, September 11th, 2003, the invasion of Iraq, and as I say, almost 20 years later, we're still living with the consequences of these events. Okay, US history in the Middle East. I'm going to pass over this pretty quickly because we're more concerned about what's happening today. But one thing to note. Early 20th century, particularly after Woodrow Wilson, the United States is extremely popular, not least because Wilson proclaims this principle of self-determination, which encourages Arab nationalism. Then if you look at the Cold War, there's several presidential doctrines: Truman Doctrine, Eisenhower Doctrine, Nixon Doctrine, Carter Doctrine. Several of these, Eisenhower and Carter especially, were in relation to the Middle East, essentially promising that the United States would intervene in order to try and contain communist influence. And then, as I say, George W. Bush's decision in 2003 to invade Iraq. That also served to increase Arab hostility towards the United States. In terms of kind of theoretical explanations for American foreign policy in the region then, well, the textbook basically outlines three possible perspectives. One is a realist perspective, and realists believe in power politics. And essentially the realist view is that the Middle East is an area of sort of geopolitical competition between various great powers. So the United States is going to be involved in the region because it's geopolitically important, and above all else, as we mentioned earlier, there's this desire to try and limit the influence of other major powers. A second view is a Marxist view, and Marxists obviously explain politics and foreign policy in terms of economic imperatives, and they essentially argue that the United States is simply trying to maintain its dominant economic position within the region. Notably, obviously, American oil companies wanting to maintain their, maintain their access to Middle Eastern oil reserves. So a Marxist perspective basically explains American foreign policy in terms of the influence that the big oil corporations wield over the American government. And then a third view is a constructivist explanation for American activities in the Middle East, and constructivists emphasize the importance of ideas, identity, and constructivists basically explain America's unique relationship with Israel in these terms. The slide here saying the US perceives the Middle East as backward, prone to conflict, but has a positive perception of Israel. Added to that is the sort of religious aspect. Obviously, the United States is a pretty religious country. A lot of Christian evangelicals in the United States, and obviously Israel is the sort of homeland for Christianity. This is the Holy Land in their perceptions, and that's significant in terms of explaining why the United States is so committed to preserving Israeli security, so committed to preserving a Jewish state of Israel. The religious aspect is also something that a lot of writers have sort of noted. So, we've got a couple of slides. I'm going to pass over these very quickly, but I've got a couple of slides here on the Cold War in the Middle East. Again, this appears in the textbook in terms of kind of explaining how American policy has evolved. Just to summarize, I think the second point on the slide here is important, that the United States does view the region in kind of Cold War terms. That's, I think, pretty evident. Just give one example, in that, here, for example, we got the fact that the Soviets were occupying Iran after the Second World War. This was one of the motivations behind the proclamation of the Truman Doctrine in 1947. But the example I was going to give isn't. Oh yes, it is here. Yes, is the sort of American view of Egypt in the 1950s. Egypt, basically led by an authoritarian leader, General Nasser. And essentially what Nasser was doing in the mid-1950s was trying to play off one superpower against the other. So he was asking support from the United States and then turning to the Soviet Union and saying, well, the Americans are giving me this, what can you give me? And in 1956, Nasser basically purchases some arms from the communist bloc. I think it's Czechoslovakia that sort of sells Egypt some weapons. And the Americans perceive this as Nasser effectively turning communist. Their view is that Nasser is now displaying communist sympathies. I think it's pretty clear that Nasser was not a communist. He was basically a sort of Arab nationalist, and he didn't really give he didn't really give a damn about communism or, for that matter, democracy and capitalism and all the rest of it. He was just trying to achieve what he felt was best for Egypt. But as I say, the Americans sort of interpret this as through a Cold War lens. They think Egypt is beginning to sort of lean towards the communist bloc. One consequence of that is that they decide to cancel the aid they were going to give to Egypt for the construction of a dam on the River Nile, the Aswan Dam, and that basically leads to Nasser nationalising the Suez Canal and the British and the French interventions in 1956. So that, I think, is a really good example of the way, as I say, America interprets what's happening in the region through a Cold War lens, through a Cold War perspective. Couple of more things to mention. 1973 Arab-Israeli War, which is the last major war between Israel and Egypt. It was President Carter then who, as we mentioned in 1978, manages to negotiate the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, which stabilizes their relationship. So the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, I mentioned a moment ago. So yeah, I mean, throughout the period, the United States during the Cold War was sort of consistently intervening in the Middle East. Okay, let's take a couple of separate topics in turn. First of all, we need to consider the American relationship with Israel. And as I say here, the United States provides a huge amount of military and economic support for Israel. I think it's fair to say that Israel as a state probably could not really function without American support, particularly the sort of military support that the United States basically provides Israel. The relationship goes back quite a long way. Truman controversially decides to diplomatically recognize the state of Israel shortly after the British withdrawal in 1948. I say controversial because opinion in the US government was actually pretty divided on that. For the first decade or so, I mean, relations between Israel and the United States weren't particularly close. As I say, point number 3, Eisenhower does put some pressure on Israel in 1950s. Really, though, from the 60s on, especially after 1967, the United States has emerged to become one of Israel's, I would say, Israel's closest ally. And as I say, Israel basically relies quite heavily on American support. 1973, the United States does send some military aid to Israel during the October War that year. a major Arab-Israeli war. It should be noted that the Europeans didn't, that the Europeans were reluctant to become involved, not least because they did not want to upset, they didn't want to disturb their relations with the Arab states, because these were the big oil producers. America, though, does send some military support to Israel. Camp David Accords, which are mentioned. America also trying to promote the peace process in the 1990s, although American support has tended to waver. I think it's fair to say that George W. Bush, who was president in the 21st century, was less focused on the peace process. So I say American support sort of vacillated. Clinton was quite keen to secure some kind of peace in the region. Bush, as I say, rather less interested. Obama, I hadn't put it on this previous slide, but Obama's relationship with Israel was also quite complicated. Obviously, the United States has sort of maintained a close, continue with its close relationship with Israel. But I think it's fair to say Obama's relations with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, were strained from the outset. Essentially, Obama felt that Netanyahu was too much of a hardliner, not willing to make enough concessions with the Arab neighbours. Should say, in terms of the actual peace process, I mean, essentially the whole rationale behind the peace process was this idea of land for peace, that Israel would sort of withdraw from some of the lands that it had occupied since 1967. In return, Israel's neighboring Arab states would sort of recognize the legitimacy of Israel, would diplomatically recognize its existence. Under Netanyahu, though, what we've seen is actually Israel has built settlements in the occupied territories, essentially kind of symbolically saying, look, no, we are here to stay. We are not going to give up these territories in return for peace. So from the Obama administration, this was quite complicated. As I say, Obama's relations with Netanyahu were pretty strained. It's also, I think, under Netanyahu, Israel's relations with the United States have become a little bit partisan, in fact, fairly partisan, I would say, in the sense that Netanyahu has not really made much of a secret in that he prefers to be dealing with Republican politicians as opposed to Democrat politicians in the United States. And then Trump obviously has come to power, and Trump has been much more supportive of Netanyahu. Trump doesn't really worry about authoritarian or populist political figures. And one particularly controversial action on the part of the Trump administration was Trump's decision to actually move the American embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is something that the Israelis had long demanded. But that kind of resulted in a sort of Palestinian counter-reaction. There was quite a lot of violence and disturbances in the region after that particular decision. Okay, why has America been so supportive of Israel? Again, different explanations for this, but one prominent explanation is this idea of an Israeli lobby in the United States. That is, there are various groups, organizations, which are basically promoting Israeli interests. And essentially, American politicians are fearful of adopting an anti-Israel position, or a position which could be perceived as being anti-Israel, because they fear the negative electoral consequences of this. Two American international relations writers, Mearsheimer and Walt, have basically argued that American support for Israel isn't really in America's best interest. So they sort of use both of them are basically realist writers, and they essentially say that the Israeli lobby wields too much influence and basically has ensured that America has adopted positions in relation to Israel which aren't actually in its best interests. As I say, many people think. Many people argue that think tanks and lobbyists basically influence policy. Also, the fact that Israel gets a lot of media coverage in the United States, and of course, there is a very big Jewish community in the United States, which they're an important constituency. Often, it has to be said, a large part of that constituency tends to be democratic in terms of its political allegiance, and a lot of American Jews are sort of quite liberal and not necessarily people who are overly sympathetic to somebody like Netanyahu, but nonetheless, as I say, large Jewish consistency. So politicians have to be somewhat careful in terms of what they say about Israel and the actual policies that the United States adopts. Okay, I'm sort of conscious that this has gone on for too long already, so I'm going to pass over the next couple of slides very quickly and end it. But oil, we've already noted, and again, I'm not going to go through every single point on this particular PowerPoint. It's enough to know that over the years, the United States has repeatedly intervened in the Middle East, and an explanation for that is that the United States wants to protect its oil interests. As I say, the relationship between the Saudi royal family in particular and the United States, that's particularly important. And again, I think it's hard not to explain that in terms of without giving consideration to the importance of the fact that Saudi Arabia is the world's biggest oil producer. Then you obviously have the Organization of Petroleum Economic States, OPEC. This is a cartel which basically manipulates the price of oil. And yes, certainly the region's importance in terms of the global economy was demonstrated very, very clearly in the 1970s when you have the oil shocks. One oil shock was a consequence of the war between Israel and the Arab states in 1973. But then OPEC also limited oil supplies and drove the price of oil even higher. And that had quite severe sort of economic consequences throughout the whole of the industrialized world. So that OPEC gives the big oil producers quite a lot of leverage. On the other hand, you often see that there are divisions within OPEC between those countries who perhaps want to increase oil supplies, others who want to restrict them as a means of trying to maintain a high oil price. We've seen this quite recently, actually, with Saudi Arabia increasing oil production as a way of lowering the price of oil because they perceive that as being harmful to Russia. Russia obviously very reliant on oil exports. Point number 3 here. So oil was an important factor behind Bush's decision to liberate Kuwait in 1990-91. Bush was quite open about that. He said, we don't want most of the world's oil supplies falling into the hands of Saddam Hussein. Another factor we need to consider, just to bring us more or less up to the present day, as I said, 9/11 had huge consequences for the Middle East. As I said, most of those who were involved in the terrorist attacks had actually come from Saudi Arabia. One consequence of that is that the Bush administration decides that they're going to have to take a much more interventionist approach within the region, and especially one of their big ideas is that they wanted to promote democracy. And that was part of the rationale for going to war against Iraq in 2003. They wanted to topple Saddam Hussein, impose a democratic government. Although the ostensible reason was also that they believed Iraq was in possession of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. And as I say, the war has huge consequences. Saddam Hussein is overthrown, but it creates wide-scale violence in Iraq. Other groups like Al Qaeda begin to kind of move into the sort of vacuum that's opened in Iraq. And as I say, the consequences of that are still kind of reverberating with that today. Again, as I said earlier, so I'm not going to go through this point by point again, but the United States after 2003 sort of finds itself bogged down in this really nasty insurgency. By 2006, the violence was really beginning to escalate in Iraq. Bush managed to stabilize the situation in 2007 to a large degree by sending in additional military forces. As I point out, although Iraq's future remains in doubt, I should bring it sort of up to date. Barack Obama becomes president. Obama, when he campaigns in 2008, a little bit like Trump, essentially promised to actually withdraw military forces, and he more or less keeps that promise in relation to Iraq. American forces are most of them anyway, are withdrawn from Iraq in the early part of his presidency. That becomes quite controversial, though, when the Islamic State suddenly emerges as a major threat, and there were plenty of critics of Obama who basically argued that he'd been too hasty to withdraw forces from Iraq. Added to that, obviously, you've got the ongoing war in Afghanistan, which has now become America's longest war. I haven't actually talked about Afghanistan today because it's not. I wouldn't necessarily put it in the Middle East as a geographical area, but along with the kind of military commitments in Iraq, you also have the ongoing war in Afghanistan as well. Lastly, then, we have the Arab Spring, which obviously has also been a huge event that has sort of shaped the politics of the region. Again, as we've noted, the United States has had quite warm relations with a number of authoritarian leaders in North Africa, the Middle East. Again, we haven't talked about Gaddafi, who was leader of Libya until 2011, because again, he's sort of North African. Again, I wouldn't necessarily put him in the Middle East. But Gaddafi overthrown in 2011. America's relations with Gaddafi for most of the time, pretty strained, but there was something of a rapprochement after 9/11, where Gaddafi is seemed to be sort of moderating his foreign policy and trying to work for a better relationship with the United States and other Western countries. But yeah, the American reaction to the Arab Spring, 2010, 2011, I think it's fair to say the Obama administration was initially quite restrained in its response. It did not come out fully in support of those groups that were pushing for a democratization in the region, not least because there was a general concern about instability spreading throughout North Africa and then into the Middle East. Ultimately, though, America does kind of come out against Gaddafi, supports the opposition movement there. You see the NATO intervention in 2011. Although Obama does decline to become militarily involved in Syria, there is pressure when Syria descends into a civil war and becomes a huge sort of humanitarian crisis. There is sort of pressure on Obama to directly militarily intervene there to try and bring the war to an end. Obama basically declines. He points to previous experiences such as Iraq and say that it's easy to get into these wars but much harder to withdraw from them. So yeah, mixed picture with the Arab Spring. Authoritarian leaders were overthrown, but there was always this nagging fear that more radical Islamic governments would come to power, and to some extent we've seen this in one or two countries, notably Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood, again quite a radical Islamic group, do actually come to power. Although are then sort of removed after a coup. From the American perspective, it was unclear the extent to which the Arab Spring would basically served American interests in the region. But more generally, it's led to further instability and chaos in the region, which, from the American perspective, is not a good thing. Okay, and I will finish on that point.